Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Mini Sculpting Super Show. I'm your host, Tom Mason, and today I want to show you how to sculpt integrated bases for your miniatures. Now, a lot of miniatures these days come with plastic slotted bases, in which case you have to have a slotted tab on the bottom of your figure. However, back in the day, you would see a lot of miniatures sculpted with integrated bases, and that was a really good way to just, all you had to do was cast up the miniature, and then it was ready to set on the table, ready to go. You didn't need anything extra, and you can still do that today. You still see that a lot with most historical miniatures and a lot of RPG figures. So it's a really great way to just have something on your figure, base, ready to go. You just add a little paint and it all stands up without having to source another part, worry about packing it, and things like that. So let me show you how to sculpt an integrated base. The Mini Sculpting Super Show is powered in part by Sculptomo Toys. See everything they have to offer at sculptomotoys.com. We're going to start making your integrated base similar to how we make a slotted tab. And to begin with, you'll need 2 pieces of tile or something that'll be flat and hard that you can use to squish the putty into shape, as well as some Vaseline, petroleum jelly, some sort of lubricant. And you'll want to spread the lubricant onto the 2 tiles. From there, I use 2 pieces of plastic card. They're about 2 millimeters thick, and I set them on the tile so that that will basically set the thickness of my integrated base. So once they're on the tile, I'll mix up some putty. I'm using a green stuff and Aves epoxy sculpt mix. I like to mix the Aves in with the green stuff in order to make it cure a little more rigid. It makes it easier to file and helps it be a little bit more stable and rigid when you set it on your miniature. I suggest doing about 30% Aves, 70% green stuff, or even as high as 50-50. That's a pretty good ratio. And make sure you mix up enough so that you have a large amount of putty to work with when we start this base. Voila, and just like that, we have some perfectly mixed lightish green putty. But seriously, make sure you have it really well and nicely blended. It's very important, especially when you mix Aves epoxy sculpt in with your green stuff or Procreate, because it takes a little bit to get it all blended nicely together. But once you do so, you roll your putty into a ball, or in fact you can try and do a more of a elongated shape like this if you know your base is going to be a longer size. And then you set it on to your 2 pieces of tile, and then put the other piece on top. Remember, both need to be lubricated so it doesn't stick to the tile. And then start pressing down. You can rotate it around a little bit or just press straight down, and that will squash your base down to the perfect thickness. And there you have the starting shape for your base. Now, before we can start giving some shape to this base, we need to get our miniature and set it down very close to the base, and that's so that we can see what kind of size and shape it needs to be. This is a small miniature without a very dynamic stance, so I'm gonna have to trim this down quite a bit. So you just need to take an X-Acto knife or a scalpel, something like that, and start to trim it down. And if you want it to be a square, cut it like a square. If you want it to be more rounded, then I like to cut small angles around that I can later file down. And as you're doing this, make sure you bring your miniature back to the base to keep checking to make sure you haven't left it too large, or hopefully haven't trimmed it too small. Now, with some last few refinements and a little extra press to make sure everything's nice and flat, this base is done and ready to cure. Now that the base is cured, whether you left it to sit for a while or put it in a putty oven, you can pop it off of the tile very carefully using an X-Acto blade And if you want to make any further adjustments to the shape or refinements, just take a file and sand them down. For this tutorial, I'm just going to use it as it is. Now you notice on the miniature that I've left the 2 wires from the feet sticking out, and that's always good to do whether you're doing a tab or a base, because you can use it to press the figure in and give it something a little more to hold on to. So what I'm doing right here is I'm using that little bit of wire to gouge the base, and that's just to give me a little bit of a pilot hole, a little bit of a guide of where I'm going to have to drill. I like to start by kind of pressing in one area first and then taking my pin vise and drilling, and then from there I can use the other wire to position the next hole and drill that out as well. Do one last test fit with your miniature, make sure the wires go through, and then all you need to do is add a little bit of putty and trim off the bottom wires, and your miniature is stuck on his integrated base. Now the first way I showed you how to make an integrated base is probably the most common way, and that's because a lot of companies, or even yourself, you'll want to precast these just for consistency. But I want to show you another way that you can actually sculpt your integrated base directly on and into your miniature. So you want to take a piece of plastic card, the same one we used for the separate integrated base, and use that to size how high up you want your miniature to be. You can use a sculpting base like this, or a regular cork works fine as well. Just make sure the miniature is set 1 to 2 millimeters above the surface, and that will kind of give you the depth of your base. Now we're going to lay down an initial layer of putty. The most important part is to pack the putty underneath the miniature around the wires. You want to make sure and fill that in really nice and tight so there's no air bubbles or anything that could potentially collapse or be weak under the miniature. And so I like to just take some putty, stuff it in there, and if you want, you can even set this aside to cure, but it's not necessary. Just add it in there, and then as you want or able to, put on more putty and start to slowly extend the putty out from that center area, creating the general shape of your base. Creating the integrated base as part of the miniature in this way can really help you control the shape and form a lot easier, especially if you're working with a more dynamic miniature. The legs might be spread out very far, and you want to make sure that the base isn't too large in one area and that the feet are going to have a good spot to land. And so this is a really good way that you can help control that. And that reminds me of one more very important thing when you're making integrated bases. You need to make sure they aren't too deep front to back, or at least in the direction that they would go up into the mold and down into the mold. If you do that, they can be very prone to miscasts and things like that. So make sure you're keeping them slightly thin front to back, so to speak, if you plan on casting the miniature. The last thing you need to be mindful of is making sure that this initial layer of the base is kind of thin and actually set down a little bit from the level of the feet. And that's because we're going to add a little bit of texture on once this is set up, and we want to make sure that you don't want to make your miniature look like its feet are sinking into the base. Maybe if it's mud, maybe, but that's usually not what we're looking for. So go ahead and finish up the shape, set it aside to cure, and then we will start adding some texture. Now that the initial layer has had time to set up, we're going to sculpt one of Reaper's world famous broccoli bases. So go ahead and just set a thin layer of fresh putty and get it nice and smooth. Make sure the edges around the base are clean, and most importantly, make sure the putty is not kind of squishing up and above the feet. You don't want to make it look like the character is sinking into the base. Alright, in order to make the broccoli base, so to speak, you'll need one of two tools. You can either use a needle or pin, or you can use what I'm using here, which is a ball burnishing tool you can find at most hobby or craft stores. This is probably the simplest and easiest texture base you can ever sculpt, but it really does look good. All you need to do is take your burnisher, put a little lubricant on it. I'm using petroleum jelly, and you want to be pretty generous with it as well, and just start tapping and pressing into the putty with various amounts of pressure. You don't want to do it super deep all the time, you don't want to do it too light, but vary it a little bit. And what it does is it ends up giving you kind of this fun little whimsical grass effect that is really great for dry brushing and will capture washes, so it's very easy to paint as well. It goes without saying that you can do the exact same sort of addition of texture and theme to your integrated bases, even if you're sculpting it as a separate piece. Just leave it on your initial platform, add some putty, sculpt your texture, and you're good to go. And there's the finished broccoli base. And just as we did before on the separate integrated base, you're going to want to carefully pop and pry your miniature off of the working stand. Just be very careful when you do this so you don't slip and cut yourself. And once you've freed the miniature from the holder, you're going to want to trim off any excess putty that kind of worked its way down into the cracks. And then you'll finish the miniature off by snipping off the extra wire that's protruding down there. Once we've done all that, we can move on to adding a small little signature plate into the bottom of our integrated base. Adding the nameplate to your integrated base is the last thing you can do to really polish off your miniature. So how I'm going to do that is I'm going to take my Dremel tool and I'm going to very carefully grind out a groove in the bottom of the base. Now this actually is good for two things. One, you can grind out in the base if you want to maybe make it a little thinner, maybe create a little cavity, uses a little bit less metal. Not that big a deal in this miniature because it's such a tiny area anyways, but it can be helpful, especially if you have a large base. Or if you're going to make a nameplate like we're going to do, because you don't want to just stick some putty on the bottom of your base, because then you won't have that nice level surface that we've worked so hard to get already. So take your Dremel tool and very carefully grind out a space where we can add in a little bit of extra putty and we can sign our name. Trim off any excess with an X-Acto knife and clean it up, and we'll be ready to add the nameplate. Alright, this is the last step, I promise. All you're going to need is a little bit of putty, a scalpel, and a clay shaper. So take your little bit of putty you mixed up and spread it nice and flat into your cavity. You don't have to fill it up entirely, but just you want to make sure that whatever you're putting in there won't rise past the bottom level of the base. So you can push it in with the clay shaper, with your finger, maybe spread it out, and then trim off any excess with your X-Acto blade. When that's complete, all you'll need to do is take your scalpel and gouge in the letters for your initials, or name, or company, whatever you want to do. Well, I hope you found this helpful and will be able to incorporate some of these techniques into sculpting your own integrated bases. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like, comment, or subscribe to see more. Or better yet, click on this video on how to sculpt tabs and keep your base game going. I'd like to say a huge thank you to all my patrons. If you'd like to join the community and support the show, head on over there as well. Alternatively, you can check out my Gumroad, where I'll be posting additional videos for sale from time to time, or you can go to my website, thetommason.com, and check out my personal line of miniatures and sculpting supplies. But whether you're sculpting with putty or polyclay, remember, keep sculpting.